Well, in celebration of International Women's Day, the Littleton Sports Law Group wanted to have the opportunity to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities that face female athletes in the coming year. And so I'm delighted to introduce the panel that we've got discussing this today. I'm Lydia Banerjee, co-chair of the Sports Law Group, and I'm joined by Joseph Bryan, Bianca Balmelli and Sophie Cashel. We are going to just have an informal discussion amongst ourselves about some of the issues that we're all thinking about and talking about and working on. And if there's any of the issues you want to get in touch with us about afterwards, then please feel free to do so. Well, guys, I think we have to start with football. It's such a big topic, but for women's sport in particular, it's a fabulous opportunity. I know that's something you've been looking at recently, Sophie.
Yeah, I think we can't get away from the fact after the World Cup in 2023, women's sport, in particular with football, has just exploded. We're seeing a huge increase in interest in women's football. And obviously 2024 is a fantastic year to continue that momentum. We've got the Paris 2024 Olympics, we have the qualifiers for the 2025 Euros, and also in May of this year, I believe it is, the World Cup 2027 hosts will be announced. I believe there's 3 still in contention. But those, one
Do you know
will be
what they are?
Oh, you put me on the spot there. Yes, I think it is. So some have joint interest, expression of joint interest. So I believe it's Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands is number 1. Number 2 is Brazil, and number 3 is another joint interest with Mexico and America. So one of those will be selected, which will be interesting.
It'll also be interesting because women's sport has obviously gained a lot of momentum in America. Just mentioning the US football, the women's football legal battle to get equal pay. There's a new statute in America to ensure equal pay and sort of amenities and facilities for women. So that it would make sense for them to pitch for this.
Yeah, and they've definitely, obviously the US soccer team are phenomenally successful, but they also have used their profile to raise opportunities and raise issues which have had positive impact for other countries that can look to them and say, well, actually, if that's the way they're dealing with it, perhaps that's something that we need to be learning from it as well. And I know they've had to fight hard to get those successes, but it's great to see that in action.
Yeah, I think the problem is, as women's football and women's sport generally grows, the interest grows, it kind of highlights the issues that are about, and it encourages people to engage with those issues, but it does also highlight what issues exist, which, shining a spotlight on them. And I think with it here in the UK, the creation of NUCO is a good opportunity to really grasp with those issues, and we'll see how that happens and how they deal with them.
Well, I suspect there are going to be imminent developments in respect of NUCO in particular, NUCO being one of the key recommendations of the Carney report, which came out in July of last year. Progress has been a little bit slow, it might be said, although we had the government official response to the Carney review back in December. The government committed to setting up an implementation group, which is now having its first meeting this month, coinciding with International Women's Day. It remains to be seen exactly how NUCO will be structured, but of course it's intended to be the body that will be responsible overall for management of the professional women's game with effect from next season.
So effectively the Premier League for women.
Yes, and from a corporate sense, the structure is anticipated to be much the same as the current men's Premier League is structured, with the member clubs for the time being each having a share in the NUCO, with the FA as the national governing body also having the same golden share that they have in the equivalent for men's football.
Yes, although I think whilst you can learn from what's happened in men's football, I think this is very much an opportunity for a new path with women's football. So the CEO of NUCO has said in interviews that this is a unique opportunity. It's not necessarily going to be a 2.0 of the Premier League. They're going to look at women's sport, what works for women's football, and really build on that, as opposed to kind of copying a complete template. And I think that's brilliant in and of itself, because we can look at specific issues with women's sport and women's football, and really NUCO can really drill into those rather than kind of being stifled by a pre-made template that it has to follow. And I think that's the beauty of it.
Sorry, Lydia. Women's sport will have different issues. There'll be more of an involvement in maternity rights. I appreciate there's paternity issues that would affect the men's game, but inevitably maternity pay and time off will be more, well, will need to be more than men's. But another interesting point that we've discussed was the issue with football boots and for women, which I hadn't actually appreciated, that anatomically there would be an issue with women using men's boots.
Well, we only need to read the report that came out only this week from the Women and Equalities Committee in respect of health barriers for girls and women participating in sport. The existence of non-gendered football boots is a prime example of how those issues might arise. The report makes clear that it's only within the last 4 years or so that a female-specific football boot has been designed.
But I think the importance of it isn't just, aesthetically men's, women's boots, but the fact that anatomically there's a ligament issue or something with the knee. I'm not quite sure.
Well, there's a
medical term, but there's some issue that's caused by using men's boots if you're a female player.
Yes, well, the report explains that there is a particular propensity for ACL damage among women footballers, which is exacerbated by the lack of adequate bespoke equipment.
I think this really highlights an issue which applies across all sports, which is the lack of research into sort of the female body, the female athlete, and the impact of the equipment that they're using to train and to compete with. And often it is just a smaller version of the men's, without any thought given to whether that's actually appropriate, whether it provides the right support, whether it's actually the right equipment. I think the statistic is something like less than 6% of sports science research is carried out on exclusively women. Now that's staggering when you consider not only are women 51% of the population, but they are also, when you come to athletes and things, we have some unique differences which we know about.
Yeah.
You know, female experience of puberty, female experience of menopause, all of these things need express female research. You cannot do that through male research and just read it across. It doesn't work. And I think we see that, just to mention it briefly, but we see that with the Kester Semenya issues and the Dutee Chand issues, that we did not have comparative data for female athletes. And so we're looking at a particular group of women with a particular medical condition of hyperandrogenism, and we don't actually have the wider data pool for women in order to be able to put that research in context.
Yeah.
And that's actually leads to risk of injury, but it also means that we're ignorant on areas. And I'm so excited to hear that the CEO of NUCO is saying, well, this is new. Yeah. We have to do it in a new way.
That ties in with the Olympics. I read some interesting statistics that for the London Games, that was the first games at which each participating country had a female athlete. And more interestingly, in the 2020 Tokyo Games, that was the most gender balanced Olympics there's ever been. There were around 49% of the participants were women. And putting that statistic in the light of fact that it's 6% of sports sciences focuses on women athletes. It just is an area that needs a lot more development.
I think it's also important, it's not just, you know, the regulations, the governance with these competitions itself, but it's also training. You know, if data is all skewed to male centric data, the way that women are training, the way you know, the drills they have to do are all based on the evidence from male centric data, and no wonder then we have issues with injuries and the ACL, you know, tears, etc., which predominantly affect women. We've had several high profile women footballers out of the game recently because of it, and it does make you wonder. We need to go back to the very beginning, get this data, because it really impacts everything thereafter.
Yes, but doesn't the equality report pick up on that?
Well, it does, yes. And it highlights a parallel track here, which is not only the data-led side of the issue, but the cultural side of the issue. There are cultural barriers, systemic barriers in outdated attitudes still persisting. The report of the Women and Equalities Committee tracks this through all of the phases from early years education right through to later life, from grassroots all the way through to elite level professional sport. And even if you take the example of early years education involving girls in football and other sports at school level, There are concerns about PE kits, sports kits. There are concerns about period-related concerns and outdated cultural attitudes. For instance, one of the respondents to the committee's evidence sessions highlighted that only 31% of girls feel encouraged by their dads to get involved in sports, compared to 50% of boys feeling encouraged. Now, I'm not saying that all dads need to now be the next Richard Williams, compiling an 85-page plan for Venus and Serena to become top-level athletes. But dads as well have a responsibility to equalise that playing field.
I guess a little anecdotal evidence. I mean, I have a son and my husband takes him to Little Kickers. But looking at Little Kickers, I would say it's 50-50 girls and boys. So at least from a 2-year-old perspective, there is more of a engagement, I think, nowadays with getting girls into sport at a young age.
I totally agree, and I a range of children, and they have, when they go to sporting activities, it is a real mixture. But I think it's interesting that certainly was not an experience that I necessarily had, and I think therefore, whenever somebody is trying to change things, and this is picked up in the review, isn't it? There is those attitude changes that need to go through, and actually, if sports need to engage with parents, mums and dads, to say, this sport is for your child, whatever it may be. There's whatever stereotypes you may have, come and have a go, let them have a try of it. And we often expose them to sports which we know about ourselves. And actually, if sports can engage at that grassroots level, taster days, that sort of things, then you get real opportunities for people to say, oh yeah, I quite like that, I'd like to go for it. And I think that's somewhere where we have a real luxury, actually, in the developed West, where we have opportunities where we can do this. And we see that benefit playing out in female participation. We still have a long way to go, as the report identifies, but we do see a benefit. But really, for global sport, we've got to raise the game across. Otherwise, when you have an international competition, it's a bit like when the US say, well, this is the World Series and it's just all US teams, right? If we want it to be, a really top-notch netball competition, hockey competition, football competition, whatever sport it is, we need to have a number of teams in the world who are really genuinely competitive. And how we do that, I think, is a huge challenge for women's sport.
Yes, and sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the big struggles, and it was something I was surprised about. So obviously, we all know Lionesses winning the Euros made a massive impact on women's football and the investment in women's football. And I was surprised when I was reading an article about the Hermosa-Kiss and trying to find what's been happening since. And part of the comment the article made was that Atiana Bonmati made mention of the fact that despite Spain winning the World Cup, there actually hasn't been that big a drive and investment in women's football in Spain. And I think one of the ways, and just another article I read, there was sort of top 5 tips on how to get more engagement in women's sport. One of them was, for instance, watching the sport. But interestingly, another one was specifically getting involved in sport. And that touches on what you've said.
Well, it's clear that girls now have really strong role models in the Lionesses and other elite level athletes. But it's now time, I think, for sports themselves to become role models for other sports, whether in this country or across the world. So, for instance, the Women and Equality Committee report makes clear that netball is leading the way in pregnancy and maternity rights. And in terms of formulating applicable policies, that's absolutely something that other sports can learn from. We have seen developments in the Women's Super League and the Women's Championship with the 14-week full pay maternity leave policy being recently introduced. But it's time for a sort of sharing of policies across the board.
And when we talked earlier about the fact that we don't have to replicate a man's approach here, I think that's a really key point, is actually these sports, particularly some of the smaller ones that don't have the same level of funding as, say, women's football, which obviously is still a long way behind men's football, but it has more funding than most sports. There's a real opportunity there for them to say, well, what are you doing about maternity? Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's work together on this. Or I wonder if there's something we can do together on female participation and try different sports. Let's go and host an event together. And there's an opportunity to then become a role model to the men's game as well, to sports which struggle to get participation. So I feel like there's a lot of energy and excitement around women's sport, which creates a real opportunity.
I think the reason we always speak about football and, well, I guess also women's football, is just it's one of those really widespread sports. I mean, yes, there's rugby and cricket, but they're just not as global as football. And I do think that that's why football always comes out into sort of first place, and they need to sort of make the way for everyone else. But like you said, they can sort of steer the guidance, and then other sports can pick it up, or women's football can pick it up from netball.
I think it's really important to not, kind of dissect each sport and compartmentalize them, because really we're looking at women's sport as a whole. And we can really learn from one another in each other's fields. Obviously they have their own unique issues within women's football itself, the ACL issues, and I'm sure in women's football, women's netball, you'll have specific issues to them. But I think there's a really important lesson to be learned, that we shouldn't just be looking at issues for women within football, issues for women within netball. We should be looking at women's issues in sport, and therefore we should use the opportunity for the football stakeholders, the netball stakeholders, all to get together. And I think you mentioned the Carney report. I do believe this was picked up on in that, and when the government were looking at their recommendations in the implementation group, I believe there was commentary on they want to bring together all stakeholders, not just with football, but also other general stakeholders, to understand how we can learn from one another, in particular in respect of kind of the women, the data gap, etc. Because netball, or I think it's netball, is kind of further along in that respect as opposed to women's football.
I think so, and there's a real momentum now towards sharing of best practice, not only in the Carney report, as you say, but also now in the WEC committee report. One of their recommendations is to establish a permanent working group on sharing best practice in pregnancy and maternity policies in elite level sport.
But as much as I agree with that, I think one needs to remember that as much as one would hope that socially things would change just because that's the right thing, pragmatically it's money talks. And the fact is, I have statistics here from the PwC survey where they say more than 70% of sports executives believe women's sports revenue will grow by more than 15% over the next 5 years. And that's once again why I appreciate that we need to look at all sports and one shouldn't compartmentalize. But women's football is going to be focused on because that's where the money is. And as sad as it sounds, that just is reality.
I think, there's a difference between the commercial side of things and the cultural side of things and the kind of social aspect of things. And I think that you're right, commercially. I think Deloitte did a report and said that it was going to be $1 billion industry in terms of women's football. Really has that potential to grow. And that does bring in unique opportunities to be the leader in its field. But I think when in doing so, it shouldn't forget that it also needs to learn from and help others and as it continues to grow.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, as you can see, we could obviously talk about this probably all day, given half a chance, but I think it's probably an opportunity for us to wrap things up there. Thank you very much, each of you, for joining and sharing your thoughts. And I suppose I just want to celebrate the women who are athletes, who are broadcasters, who are commentators, who are coaches, who are all of the behind the scenes roles as well. And I think on International Women's Day, for those of us who practice as sports lawyers, we're really excited about the opportunities for women's sport. And we want to thank all of those who work in sport in any role for all that they do, because this is a really exciting time for women's sport generally. And happy International Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day.